And a very good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Saturday night spiritual discussion, coming to you from the Paul Christian Spiritualist Church. Tonight, we've got a wonderful gentleman with absolutely astounding and somewhat intimidating lineage there, Mr. Carr-Gomme, the wonderful Phillip Carr-Gomme. Sir, thank you and welcome to our evening.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely beautiful. Phillip, if you could just give us just a little brief bio of your background, please. That would be wonderful.
Well, when my first sort of spiritual awareness began when I was about 11, that was when everything the lights got switched on, I suppose. I can't remember much before the age of 11. But when I was 11, I read a book called The Life of the Buddha. And I was really struck by that, and I decided that that was the only goal worth pursuing, was the goal of enlightenment. And in that same year, I met the old chief Druid, who my father worked for. He was a friend of my dad, but he ran a college in London, and my dad worked for him as a history teacher in the college as well. And so from that age, I started kind of exploring spirituality. And then when I was 16, 17, I asked to be, I became intrigued by my Druid teacher's work and started studying with him, and asked if I could be initiated into the Druid order that he was the chief of. And he said no. And of course, a 17-year-old being told no, and you have to wait till you're 18, and I had to wait a whole year. And, but when I was 18, I was initiated on Glastonbury tour, and that began a long sort of path that I'll try and condense into a couple of minutes for you, which is that he died in 1975. In 1988, I was asked to reform the order, and I led the order for 32 years. And then just 2 years ago, I handed over the role of Chief of the Order to a colleague, Emma Burke, from Ireland, and she is now the Chief of the Order. And I'm a psychologist, so alongside my interest in esoteric matters and spiritual matters, I've always been interested in psychology and weaving the two interests together, really. And so I now have an online school where I teach various sort of esoteric disciplines with the tarot, lessons in magic, which is about really working on your wishes and how to make your dreams come true, and sophrology, which is a sort of system a bit like mindfulness that comes out of the French-speaking world. And so that's what I do in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Absolutely. Slight bit of an echo there. Just let me quickly try something here. Hopefully that will cure the echo. That is great. Do you know the one thing you said? Well, you said a lot of things there which totally intrigued me, totally fascinated me. I've been doing my homework on you. If I keep looking down, being thoughtful, I'm not. I'm quickly reading up. So, but that was quite interesting that you couldn't be ordained until you were 18.
Yes, and I suppose there's a theme in here that might be of interest to you because of the spiritualist connection. Is that when my Druid teacher died, I studied with him for about 7 years, and then he died. And after he died, I had an incredibly powerful dream that about 2 days after he died, where this sort of he was standing with a circle of people, and I was asked to lie down on an ancient barrow, these wonderful barrows that we have in the countryside, and he and a group of people stood around, and then they sort of poured this energy into me, and I actually woke up in this dream. It became a lucid dream, and I woke up and I had to actually ask them to stop because I thought I was going to die or be, overcharged, as it were. There was just too much electricity, as it were, flowing through. And then I couldn't get a sense of him for about 9 years. And I was disappointed in that, because I was really trying to get a sense of him on the other side. And in the meanwhile, the little, the order that he had started disbanded. There were very few people in it. I followed interests in Rosicrucianism, in the Kabbalah, in psychology, and but not one day, completely out of the blue, I'd started to forget about him, to tell you the truth, after 9 years, got married, had a child, and so on, busy life. And one day I was meditating, and at that time I was working with a type of meditation which in Zen is called, Zazen, which is just sitting. It's where you just go blank. You just sit quietly in a receptive, meditative mood, without asking for anything, without doing anything, without reciting a mantra or anything. And I was sitting there, and suddenly he was in the room with me. And I didn't see him, sort of clever, he didn't appear to my sight, but he was absolutely there, and he started to speak to me. And he told me that I should start the order again, and that everything would become clear, and that the manuscripts and documents would arrive, and so that everything would be, and that I should lead, because he'd created this group, and then it had disbanded because he'd died, in the way that small groups do sometimes. And then from that moment, it was utterly extraordinary experience. And from that moment onwards, the most incredible series of synchronistic events occurred. As an example, at that time, I used to work in Longacre, Covent Garden. And one of the things he asked me to do was to get all of his books, because being a sort of teenager at the time, I knew him, in early 20s, occasionally he gave me one of his books, and I had rather perhaps arrogantly assumed that he would give me all of his books in the end. So I never bought them, and they were privately published and not available. And I walked into the shop opposite the office where I worked, and I said, would you by any chance happen to have any books by Ross Nichols privately published during the war? And they said, well, that's extremely unlikely. But he went down into the basement, and he came up 5 minutes later with a little packet tied up with string. And it was one of his books with letters to a friend and drawings. So it was like a letter, physical letter. And that was the day I had this experience with meeting him. I'd had the experience in the morning, and this was lunchtime the same day, and so on until any doubt that I might have had that this was wishful thinking or my imagination was completely, dismissed from my mind. I knew it was a genuine contact with somebody on the other side. And I started to have a series of the most beautiful dreams of being with him. And so I started putting all of his teachings in the form of a distance learning course. And in the first year, 200 people were taking it. In the second year, 600. And now we have 25,000 people who are members of the order all over the world. The course is published in 5 languages. We have monthly podcasts and 200 groups around the world. It's just extraordinary. But if I had been skeptical on that day and thought, oh no, this is just my imagination running riot, and I hadn't followed his requests and promptings, life would have gone in a completely different direction.
Yeah. Brilliant. Sorry, we've got an annoying echo back again. 2 seconds, sir. Let's try that. Now you can see what it's like being a guest on StreamYard. Isn't this wonderful? When we started here at Paul doing these broadcasts and inviting in people from all different walks of life, different understandings and beliefs, the one thing that really shone out to me was the commonalities that we all share. It's been a great time to actually, sort of like decloak and take away the mysteries of things. I've said this to you before we went on air, and you know that I am not being rude or offensive. If somebody said a druid, people probably think, oh yeah, long hair, lives in the Volkswagen camper, and that's about it, However, you, for example, you have this amazing, and as I said, sometimes intimidating to me, to little old me.
Yeah.
You have a degree in psychology, you trained in psychotherapy and play therapy for children, sophology, which you've touched upon. Also the Montessori, and you're the founder of the Lewis Montessori School. You're author or co-author of over 20 books. This is absolutely amazing. But that experience that you had there with seeing from from the spiritualist side, that really is understandable. We really get that because we hear it. It's in our lineage, it's in our custom and practice, it's in our ancestry as well. And it is quite common very shortly after a passing for that person to be there very much and then disappear for quite a while. But that coming back, and like you say, the synchronicity of things, I've experienced that here a great deal when we were setting up in COVID and things to do. The right people were just there, and it just happened. And, it is absolutely awesome. Big warm welcome to everybody who's joining us. I see the lovely Lynn's in from Canada and Stockholm as well. Welcome. Philip, sir, to give a sort of like a layman explanation of what is it Druidry?
Druidry, right? Yes. What is Druidry? Yes. If you look at the word in a nutshell, it expresses what it is. Dru means the etymology, the origin of Dru is the oak tree, and id is its origin stems from the word for wisdom. So if you go oak wisdom, and now the thing is there are two kinds of words. There are connotative words and denotative words. Denotative words are the ones that you want your dentist to use, like pass me drill number 5 and so on. Connotative words is the words you want poets to use, where lots of associations come from it. So if you so if you see this as connotative, then you can see how from oak we get tree, we get forest, the wild, nature, and from wisdom we have depth, understanding, knowledge, teachings, and so on. So really in that you have this idea of wild wisdom, if you like, or the wisdom of nature. And so what Druidry does is it unites a kind of indigenous earth spirituality that reverences the earth and the stars and all the natural phenomena that give us life, water, fire, air, and so on. And but it also is a tradition of scholarship. So we have about 300 years of scholarship within Druidry from a period known as the Druid Revival, which began in the 17th century. So people have been writing about this tradition for about 300 years. And it's really part of the Western mystery tradition. If I had a sort of whiteboard behind me, I could draw sort of a river, and I could show you the various streams that inform Druidry. There's been an influence from Freemasonry. There's been an influence from all the kind of cults that existed in Roman times, like the Orphic mysteries, for instance, that came to these lands at the time of the Roman occupation. And then there was the pre-Roman period, the prehistoric period, all the influence of those people who built the stone circles in the old days, and these all sort of feed together in a stream, And then as you get to the present day, you get this really interesting weaving together of environmental and ecological concerns. If you look, what you might call spiritual ecological concerns, which I think a lot of us have. A lot of us realize how important nature is, but not just as a series of physical objects, a tree, a bush, an animal, and so on, but that there's something behind that physical, or within that physical object, that is essentially spirit. And Druidry speaks to all these aspects, and I think that's why it appeals to so many people. Why it appeals to the chap living in the VW, as you said, but also, I mean, one of the things that always struck me, we have big events at Glastonbury. A couple of hundred people come to various events that we put on, and you'll have the whole range of people. You won't have just one type of person or one age group. There'll be the whole range, from young sort of 30-year-olds right through to people in their 80s, and from all kind of backgrounds and so on. Awesome. Thank you.
That was a wonderful explanation, just to give us that idea of where we are. And I really get it as well, because again, in layman's terms, you're thinking about, they just sort of like worship the seasons. It is a big part of the Druid calendar, the seasons, but it's the behind that. And I love that when you said, a tree, a bush. It's not. There's so much more behind that. I mean,
that's right. I mean, when you look at the at the moment, what's happening is science is starting to cotton onto this, and you probably we've all seen, particularly with lockdown, actually, the sort of research they're doing into the value of being in nature, walking, breathing with the air of the trees and so on. But what science does is it tries to isolate the individual, and it's a valid pursuit to isolate the elements. So a scientist will look at, say, the fact that people feel better when they walk in the forest, and they'll say, what's going on here? And they'll try and isolate the chemicals that the trees are excreting, phenols that come out of the leaves. And there's all sorts of interesting research about that. And then they will say, I mean, there's some fascinating research where they take an extract from tree leaves, the phenols in them, and put them in diffusers in hotels in Japan. And then they've done random control trials where they have some people sleeping where a diffuser is just diffusing mist with nothing in it. And then another group of people are having the diffuser with the tree oil in it. And then they take blood samples. And they find that there's a difference in the blood samples, that people's immune systems are being stimulated. So this is wonderful research, and it's very, very valuable. But one has to be aware of the fact that what they're doing is that they're extracting only one element of the beneficial process that's occurring. So obviously what's occurring is you're breathing in these phenols when you're in the forest, but you're also getting the aesthetic satisfaction of the beautiful forms and shapes of the trees. You're getting exercise. And then the Druid would say, these trees are living beings. We wouldn't be on this planet without them. Our destinies are totally woven together. And so there are spirits in these trees. And it's their energy too that we're bathing in. So it's a holistic approach, and I see somebody said, is Druidry native to the UK? Well, yes. Well, the Druidry is Druidry or Druidism. It's just another word. It's what you've written, Sam, but without the E, Druidry. And excuse me, Druidism. It means the same thing. Is the indigenous spirituality of these lands, which includes Ireland, the British Isles, and the western part of France, particularly Brittany, that sort of area. So it grew up in these lands, and so there's a way in which quite a common feeling people have is when people find that conventional religions aren't quite satisfying them, even though they might respect them or even be inspired by them, but they're not satisfying their sort of needs of the moment. They find nature religions, indigenous traditions appealing, and they often turn to Native American traditions or the traditions of other places. But very often they will find that it's somehow the land that's speaking to them, and particularly that if they live in this area or if they have ancestry from this area, because we have lots of members in America and Australia and so on. There's something about the geographical location that speaks as well. Yeah.
Fascinating. That actually brings us on very nicely to Sue Townsend's question.
Yes. For people who have different. Well, yes, this is really interesting, and in fact, I've written a book about this called "Seek Teachings Everywhere," because one of the things you find if you study different spiritualities, and that's one of the the incredible privileges we have in this age, that we have access to all these spiritual traditions and teachings at the sort of press of a button, really, is you find that at their heart they're all saying the same thing, and then from the sort of core ideas, these ideas are clothed in different clothes which suit different cultures, different levels of understanding, and so on. And this is why we need spiritual teachers to keep incarnating and giving teachings, because the way it was expressed, I mean, I don't know if you've had that experience of picking up something like, I don't know, Madame Blavatsky or Alice Bailey or something like that. It's old-fashioned, even Rudolf Steiner or something like that. And it's clothed, these sort of nuggets are clothed in this old-fashioned language and so on. So these ideas keep having to be re-expressed. And once you realize that, it's called, the sort of approach is called universalism, where you realize the universal teachings within within all these spiritual traditions. You then discover that certain aspects of certain teachings you really like, and they go together. So, for instance, you might find that you like doing yoga, but that you love Christian art, icons with all the gold in them. You might like the poems of Rumi, those beautiful spiritual poems of Rumi, who was a Sufi. And then you might stop yourself and think, oh, whoops, hang on a minute, I'm mixing my drinks. I'm imbibing from all these different streams. And my message there is, it's okay. It's okay to mix your drinks, because if you're not comfortable with it, you won't do it. If you just want to follow the path of Christianity or Druidism or Buddhism, then just follow that one path, and that's obviously the one that's satisfying you. If you find yourself drawn and nourished by various streams, that's okay too. And so I wrote this book, Seek Teachings Everywhere, to suggest this as an idea to start with in my introduction, and then to have really a series of essays on Druidry and Christianity to answer your question, Sue. Druidry and Christianity, how does that work? And it works very well. We have a lot of Christians who are Druids, for instance. But it also works very well with Buddhism and Jainism and Hinduism. It works well with Wicca. And those are the three sort of streams that I cover mainly in the book, but it would work well with other paths as well, particularly Taoism. It goes very well with Taoism.
Wonderful. There's a lovely question here from Anne Law. When I was first taken to Wiltshire area as a child, I felt a distinct draw to this area. Is there any apparent reason for this? As it turns out, my ancestors are from there.
Well, yes. I mean, I could suggest there are perhaps three reasons. First, the fact that your ancestors are from there. It's very interesting. Stephanie and I, we were both Londoners. My partner and I, we were both born in London, grew up in London, and then around our mid-30s, life brought us to the area in Sussex where we are now, Lewes, Brighton area. And it only sort of slowly dawned on us that, hang on a minute, Stephanie realized that her, grandmother had been born in Eastbourne. My grandparents lived in Hassocks. and you realize, oh, you're coming back to this place where, and we were talking about this with our business partner and a colleague in the order, Dave the Bard, and he had exactly the same experience. He ended up in Shoreham down the road, not knowing that his family history was actually from that area, but he wasn't aware of it. So I think, so there's the call of the ancestors, if you like. There's a sort of familiarity and an at-home feeling that somehow comes from the fact that one's ancestral line is perhaps from here. There might be the aesthetic reasons as well. You know, you can argue that, you know, the reason why you're drawn to Wiltshire is it's a very beautiful landscape with these wonderful, great sweeping landscapes and so on. And you could argue the same for, you know, we were drawn to this area of Sussex because of the downs and the sea, you know. But then, and then a third reason is, of course, Wiltshire is a very spiritual place in the terms of the sort of spiritual history of these islands. You have, you know, of course, you have Stonehenge, you have Avebury, you have a vast sort of really a sacred landscape. We can think of Stonehenge and Avebury as individual places on the land, but the reality is it's a whole landscape with West Kennet, Long Barrow, Avebury, Silbury Hill, Stonehenge, Woodhenge. You know, it goes on and on. It's a whole area. And when you look at southern England, it's almost like if you can imagine a starfish slightly sort of skewed, its leg going like this. And I've reproduced it in my book, The Druid Way. There are basically 5 rows of lines of hills going towards Wiltshire. You've got the South Downs, you've got the North Downs, you've got the, oh gosh, I forget now, is it the Marlborough Downs or the Wiltshire Downs? And the other thing going down. And there are 5 of them. And they all, and then in the centre where they all meet, that's Salisbury Plain, which is one of the biggest plains in Europe. Of this particular sort of geographical type. So in the old days, people would process along these hilltops at sacred times, like at Lunacer, which was the great harvest festival in the beginning of August, because that was, you know, when food was at its most plentiful. And that's where you had marriages and games and festivals and meetings and all the rest of it before everybody hunkered down for the winter. So Wiltshire the centre of Wiltshire drew people along these 5 lines, and perhaps you're tuning into some of that this is a very important centre for the British Isles.
Brilliant. I fully get that with the sorry, sound is...
You're sounding okay to me, Laurie, just so you know.
Oh, right, just my end. I've got quite a big echo.
Well, if I'm hearing it the way everybody else is hearing it, you're sounding absolutely fine with no echo at all.
Okay, I'll ignore the echo. Wonderful. Yes, very much with the drawn to areas, because this is something I became aware of quite a few years ago. There were certain parts of Devon and Cornwall where I was at home. And that is the best way I can describe it. When I got there, I've never been there before. Got off the train, I thought, I'm at home. Same with the Lake District. I got off the train, I went, I'm back home again. And geologically, these places have got a lot in common. They run along these same fault lines. And I thought, I find that fascinating.
That is interesting, isn't it? Whether you're tuning into that particular geology, whether you had past lives in those 2 places, for instance, you know, that could be another explanation. I do know that there are certain places around the world that you feel. I mean, I've had exactly that experience when I first went to Ireland. I felt I was coming home. When I went to New Zealand, I felt that too. Yeah. A
lot of interest. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for your input. The lovely Arisha, and talking of Devon and Cornwall, this is where she hails from. As I understand it, everything has its own energy, including human beings and trees. So there must be a connection of spirit. It's lovely when people recognize it. So
yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Arisha. That's wonderful. Jamie Williamson, Good evening, sir. Doesn't seem 5 minutes ago you were here. Oh, it wasn't. Philip, are there some trees, forests that are more beneficial to our well-being than others, or do they all have the same effects?
Well, I don't know the science around this, because presumably if we were talking to a tree scientist who was studying forest breathing, for instance, and was taking samples, they might tell us about certain kind of trees that exude particularly beneficial, I think they're called phenols, but I may be wrong, as opposed to others. So I don't know the answer to physical level. What I do know is that Scots, I don't know whether you experience this, but when I'm with Scots pines, I find they're incredibly energizing and uplifting, and healing. And, you know, whether that's because there's something in what they're exuding that I'm breathing in is having that effect on me, or whether it's their spirit, the kind of spirit energy that's coming from them, whether aesthetically, of course, they're incredibly beautiful. But I think that's where we can all become scientists, spiritual scientists, if you like, and kind of notice that would be a very interesting project, wouldn't it, over the coming months, as you walk in different woods, to hold that question, you know, is this wood helping me more than the wood I visited last week, and so on. And I would imagine, just off the top of my head, there's all sorts of reasons why one wood might feel better than another. One would be the types of trees. The other would be the type of soil, because Laurie was mentioning the geological fault lines and so on. The fact is, the geomagnetic energy changes. If you had a sort of meter, you can measure it, and it just changes depending on the fault lines that are down there and the kind of rock, whether you're on clay or sand or whatever. And that's going to have an effect on you. It's going to feel different. I know generally a sort of clay soil compared to a sandy soil feels heavier. So that, for instance, I remember driving from the forest of Brocéliande, which is this magical forest in Brittany, which are mainly sort of oaks and beeches on a sort of quite a heavy soil, clay soil. Driving south towards the inland sea of Loch Maricare, whatever it's called, I've forgotten. And there we got to Scots pines on sandy, and the different feeling. It felt so much more energizing and healing. So yes, an interesting project. I'll join you in that, and let's see what we come up with.
And very nicely, Jamie is saying he was thinking of pine trees.
Yeah, there you go. Actually,
here in Poole, outside our local railway station, they did plant a couple of Scots pine trees, and they're low hanging at the moment, and most people are walking around them. But I love to walk under them because it draws you in. Yeah, absolutely beautiful. Sam Nurse is back. Remaining with geography, have there been particular traditions within Druidry that have evolved in different areas?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think the way to understand, or one perspective to take, which I think can be helpful, is that some students of religion divide religions or spiritualities into two categories, type A and type B. I can never remember which way round it is, but say type A are the revealed religions. So these are bodies of teaching revealed to one person, usually a man, which are then encoded in writing and are then commented on and developed and argued about and so on. So the obvious examples are Christ and Muhammad, and to a lesser extent Buddhism, but to some extent. And then type B religions, or the other type of religion, are indigenous religions, which grow up over time and there is no one individual that articulates it and it all gets set down in writing. That it's usually an oral tradition. And so you have, if you can imagine, the best way to picture this, I think, is to imagine the ice sheets melting. You know, the ice sheets went right the way down about 2/3, 3/4 of Britain. So, you know, the people were all on mainland Europe. And then as the ice sheets melted, people, hunter-gatherers, moved back up into Britain and Ireland. And with it, they brought with them a kind of animistic culture that sensed the sacred in everything. So the moon and the stars and the sky, and in the fire when it was lit, you know, and they were probably goddess worshipping. They will have seen everything as possessing spirits, so the trees and the animals and so on. And then gradually, over hundreds of years, in fact, thousands of years, this would gradually kind of develop in amongst tribes into what finally became known as Druidry today, you know, Druidism, in about 1000 BC, perhaps, something like that, 500 BC. And so it would have varied according to regions by definition, but with certain sort of similar strands, as it were, in terms of, you know, reverencing nature and the natural world and so on. And then at some point, as tribes started to connect to each other, and then when you know, just before the Romans came, and then when the Romans came to begin with, they tolerated Druidism. It started to develop into a much more organized tradition before the Romans got cross with, you know, Boadicea, and there's the whole story of what happened with Boudica or Boadicea and so on. So yes, that in a nutshell, or not a nutshell, in a rambly sort of way. I hope I've explained a bit of it.
Yeah, that was great. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Christina Thaloris here from Stockholm is asking, are there any books about Druidism you can read to get a better understanding? Christina, you've asked exactly the right man.
Well, it's a bit tricky because I suppose it sounds a bit. Does it? Well, it's only because the British are so inculcated to be modest, aren't we? We're taught that we must never.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah, you know what I mean. So if I was modest, I wouldn't say what I'm about to say, which is, I think if you could read one of my books, I've written. There's two books to get an idea, really. One is called the Druid Mysteries, which gives you a really broad overview, and in some depth as well. So that's called the Druid Mysteries, and you'll find it on my website. And there's the Druid Way, which is a more sort of lyrical, if you like, a different approach to imparting these ideas, where I essentially set foot and walk in the landscape to the Long Man of Wilmington and back. And during that time, you know, a friend dies, and then another friend dies, and I sort of weave in ideas about life and death and teachings, but all in the form of this sort of journey. So people have told me that that's the easiest one to read because you're reading a travelogue, if you like. So I would say those might be good starter books. But Penny Billington has written a great book on Druidry as well. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I can't, but a Google of Penny Billington would bring it up. Oh, you're putting the link.
I am,
Laurie. Yeah, that's very kind of you.
Just trying to find Penny Billington. The Path of Druidry.
That's it. Yes.
There we go. Where were we before good old Google, eh?
Yes.
To actually go out and learn these things. This absolutely amazing evening. Absolutely beautiful. Sorry, I just popped that link in there. There you go, Christina. You have a full library there that you can investigate. Sue Townsend, in view of climate change affecting our environment, have you any input about what trees would be best to plant in order to preserve our UK woodlands and forests, which would be survive increasing heat and less rain?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm not qualified to answer it. And I should know the answer to that. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that question and find out. But if I can respond to the question in a slightly different way, which is related though, which is the other day I was doing a bit of work with the trees from a Druidic perspective, and I was thinking about the elm tree, and I was researching the elm, and of course we all know that the elms have all but been wiped out. I mean, they were very common trees in Britain, and over the last 40 years they've been absolutely decimated. And I came to a site in the end of when it was the Forestry Commission or the Woodland Trust, where you realize how complicated these are. There's basically people who call themselves elmies, who are just lovers of the elm, and they're working on trying to create strains of elms that resist the bug that kills elms, and they're trying to reintroduce these hybrid elms into the British countryside. And you think my initial reaction was, this is fantastic, how wonderful. But then I read the Woodland Trust's response to that, which is that because these are hybrids and they're taking DNA from Japanese elms and all the rest of it, that there's some issue. I've forgotten what the issue is now, to tell you the truth, but there's some sort of issue about them not being resilient enough, or it being artificial, and therefore, and their argument was much more about letting nature take its course. So there's this interesting question around to what degree we try, because one of the things that I've learned in the last few years is, if, say, you had 2 acres of land and you wanted to plant trees on it, depending on where you are and the situation, or the best thing you could probably do is fence it off so that deer and other animals can't get at it, and you let it regenerate on its own, because trees will start to grow there. As you know, in the garden, if you don't weed a little patch, you find little ash trees scooting up, and all sorts of saplings and so on. Is that the best? And so I was fascinated by this and had a long talk with an arborist friend who's involved in tree planting campaigns, and he said, yes, it's incredible, because it's as if nature's wisdom knows the trees that need to be there will be there, the ones that can survive, and the companion trees that look after each other. We always tend to see trees as sort of isolated individuals, and actually, all this wonderful work that's been done on the mycelium and the connectedness between trees, you realize it's a community that's all working together. And if you let them plant themselves, they build up this community of different species, and that will thrive best on that soil. So perhaps that's relevant in some way, but I think really the answer would have to come from an arborist, a tree specialist.
It's actually a very interesting, raises an awful lot of things to think of there. Do we interfere? Or is there going to be a forced evolution up here? And when we start playing with DNA, there's all sort of inherent risk. Because one of the wonderful things that's been coming out of all these talks is the interrelation now with what I would say hard science with spirituality and all things esoteric. It's almost like we actually hold the fifth element, and scientists, I strongly believe, are more aware of that, but they're trying to tie it down to a physical, like you were saying, with the extract from the tree, without the holistic whole approach. So it's not something that's going to sit on a bench somewhere and be examined. It's something that's probably it's going to require that trust element, which is something, talk to any medium, that's the worst word. Oh God, we've got to trust all the time. But it is fascinating, as I say, and I do like that term, the fifth element, to come in there. And it is being looked at now. It is asked questions about, it's being studied. We had a wonderful man on last night from Brazil in our Spiritist talk. And he said something, and I thought, you know what, I love that. He said 50 odd years ago, scientists didn't understand the power of the mind and how much that played in our life, our evolution, our actions and everything, because everything was put down to bodily functions and everything else. And not a lot of attention was attributed to the mind. He said, but now, 50 years later, we realize that 99% of our physical ailments and abilities stem from issues in the mind. He said, I wonder how long it will be before we start saying about the spirituality, which at the moment is sort of like, you know, poo-pooed. Yeah, we leave that to those people. They can play with that before it goes through that regenerative phase of actually becoming into the mainstream and just being accepted.
And I think, you know, in some ways, it's actually in the mainstream already, you know. I mean, if you did a couple of examples, I mean, the Royal College of Psychiatrists have, if you're a psychiatrist, you can join a special interest group. And their spirituality special interest group has thousands of members, psychiatrists, who are members of this group. And the more you talk to people, the more and more people, I think, are understanding this, the importance of spirituality. Actually, it is really changing really quite fast, I believe.
Yes. A few years ago, I was talking to a psychiatrist from Broadmoor Hospital in a social situation, everybody. All right. Not in a professional one. Do not worry. And just in conversation, it came out that I work as a medium as well. And he found that fascinating. And he's saying about, we found like 98% of the causes of different things in people associated with issues within the brain. He said, but we've got this elusive 2%. And I said, and I said, you think they come from an external force? And he went, I do. And I thought, that is really promising.
Quite, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
Where are we with the question? Anne Law's back. In nurse training, I remember that I think I was Descartes brought in the separation of mind and body in treatment, and yet clearly MH affects physical health. Are you picking up the gist from that, Philip?
Yes, sure. Descartes.
Descartes, yes.
Yes, and mental. The mind-body connection again is more and more being explored. I think it's really quite exciting, and in the field of well-being and of mental health and physical health, understanding the effect of the mind is becoming increasingly studied, as far as I can see. Yes,
indeed. And what we can do to alleviate those conditions is by being in this natural environment, bringing back in nature, bringing in that fifth element into our understanding.
And I think as well is, you know, one of the extraordinary findings in the placebo effect is that even when people know it's a placebo, in other words, in experiments where they say to people, look, I know you've got a headache now, but I'm going to give you a pill, but it's just a sugar pill. So you tell them, you know, there's no medical ingredient in this, but I'd like you to take this pill with water because people feel better. So even when they know that it's, you know, that it's doesn't have an active ingredient, still it makes them feel better, which I find extraordinary.
Excuse me. We're both having a little coffee here tonight. What's going on? With Druidism, you've just gave me this amazing lineage, restarting a small group up to, is it 25,000 members?
Yeah.
Is this a continued, sustained growth in there? Or are more and more people, especially since we've had the introduction of COVID into our environment, has it sparked more interest there?
I think, yes. I mean, certainly from the beginning of the millennium, when we had, that awful disaster of 9/11, that began a sort of really quite marked upward trend in the number of people who are asking questions about their purpose in the world. Because I think when you see difficult things happening and painful things happening, it makes you question life. What's going on? What's happening here? That's the sort of silver lining in these things. I mean, I think the pandemic has been such an interesting phenomenon because on the one hand, it's been awful, of course, and lots of people have died and suffered and so on. And so there's no way that one can be pleased about that at all. However, what one does have to say is that it's changed a lot of people in positive ways. And, we all know, how for a lot of us, say working from home, deciding to prioritize what's really important rather than being distracted all the time, and slowing down, all these things we're familiar with. One piece of information that you may not be familiar with is around mental health, is that we've heard a lot of publicity about the negative effects of the pandemic on mental health, but we haven't heard much publicity about the positive effects. Now that's because the media like upsetting people essentially, and good news doesn't sell news. So, but whilst it's true that the pandemic has created a lot of stress for people at the level of mental health, it's also done the opposite. It's also done the opposite because people have found, I do a weekly broadcast on YouTube and Facebook called Tea with a Druid on Monday evenings. And it's just very brief. It's 20 minutes, half an hour of just a little chat about a spiritual topic and then a meditation. It's like a little sort of oasis of calm in a week. And I first picked this up when during the pandemic, a couple of people commented in the comment box that they had stopped taking their antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication during the lockdown. And I thought this was fascinating, and I started to do more research. I started to ask fellow psychotherapists, and they were saying the same thing. They said, yes, I have a number of clients who are no longer taking their medication because all the pressures of that sort of fast-paced society that we had created pre-pandemic were dropping away, and then you had a funny effect is as we came out of lockdown, that created stress for these people because then they were having to go back to work or interact socially with people. So it's complex, but there are positive elements in that have come out of it for people's mental health as well. People have been taking much more exercise, going for walks in the country more, with consequent improvements in mental health. And as we've seen, people exploring spiritual teachings as well.
Definitely. I used to work on the railways for many years. And our first 7 trains every morning were what I called the bread and butter trains, because these were the same people, same train, Monday to Friday, going up to London, returning in the evening, and actually losing a whole day in traveling on a train and all that goes with it. The hustle when you get off the train, the hustle to get to the tube, the frustration when you have a delay. We never had delays on the trains. Unheard of. And then suddenly all that has been taken out of their life. And that must have been a really interesting effect on people, because we do operate very much in our routines. Our routines become our life, and without thinking. And then suddenly all that was taken away. And we've noticed here within the church and talking to other spiritualist churches, a great upsurge now in people attending the churches as they're beginning to reopen. Because,
Really?
like you say, we've all had a mortality challenge. And
Yeah.
2 years ago, we didn't think about it, you know. Have you
Absolutely.
made a will out? Oh, why would I make a will out? You know, because you're going to die one day.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sue Townsend back. And could you talk a little about connecting with Spirit of Place and also Spirit of Water too, i.e. the Glastonbury Chalice Well?
Well, you know, that's in Druidry, connecting with Spirit of Place is extremely important. What we do is we recognize that as spiritual beings, we're, you know, in essence, outside of our everyday understanding of time and space. We're sort of infinite, eternal beings. And then we incarnate into the dimension of space and of time. And that's where we live for our incarnation. And when we die, we're released from those two coordinates and out into this wider, freer world. And we celebrate time with our seasonal festivals, you know, so 8 times a year we have special ceremonies for the equinoxes and solstices and so on, to really celebrate and open to the magic of that particular time. But we also celebrate place as well. And so we encourage people in the order, members in the order who are doing the training with us, to create sacred places in their homes, inside and outside, and also to get to know their local sacred places. And if people feel drawn to becoming a guardian of that place, which may be as simple as, you know, on your daily walk, just clearing any litter that gathers in that particular area, or perhaps if there's a little local spring somewhere, making sure that it's clean, doesn't get choked with weeds and so on. So doing something actually physical, and then simply meditating in that place is a way of not only sort of improving our own well-being and tuning in at a deeper level, but there's some sort of mysterious relationship that exists between us and place. And if we spend time in sacred places and are just quiet and tune in, something's going on, something is happening that is strengthening the vibrations of that place. And we all know about how certain places feel good. If there's been lots of good thoughts, good feelings, good happenings in a place, it'll feel good. If there's been some very difficult, dark stuff going on in a place, it'll feel difficult and dark. So simply by giving our good energy, as it were, or tuning in, being present in these sacred places, we're somehow contributing to that work. And that's what people have challenged. Well, of course, people do that very consciously and deliberately there, and that's why it feels so great, I think, you know.
Absolutely awesome. Yes. Interesting is you say we've talked about areas where we go, where we feel totally at home, and it's like, this is awesome. Likewise, there are areas that you go to. There's one area near here, and I've always said, if you gave me a house there, I wouldn't live there.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong, you know, it's not next to the sewerage farm or
yeah, that's right,
underneath the nuclear dump or anything like that. It's just not,
doesn't feel good.
Me. Yeah,
yeah,
not for me.
Yeah.
Philip, sir, absolutely amazing evening. Thank you so much. I appreciate you're an extremely busy man, and for sharing this talk time with us is so much appreciated.
It's a pleasure, Laurie. It's a pleasure, Laurie, and I'm glad to have spent this time with you.
Yeah,
and good luck with your series and your project.
Thank you. As I say, I will convert this to a podcast as well to share out there. So we're getting the word out. Everybody's doing our own little thing in our own little ways, but it all adds up, is my belief.
That's right.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hello, Joan. Got Philadelphia on as well tonight, watching you. So how wonderful is this? Next week, we have Bill Rich. So it will be a Lyceum evening. And Bill is very much noted for working with guides. So he'll be here to give a short presentation on working with guides and to answer questions, because it's always quite a sticking point with somebody. The most commonest thing said is, I don't know my guide. So we can ask questions and gain some tips and advice from the lovely Bill. Philip, on behalf of everybody here tonight and everybody watching in the future and listening in the future, sir, you are awesome. I absolutely love you to bits. Thank you, thank you,
Thank you, sir. Okay.
Good night, everybody.